for inviting me, AISA as well. I'll speak for 45 minutes. Is that 45 minutes followed by question and answers. So let me just begin by saying that I'm not an international relations expert. I'm no area study specialist. I don't know the region. But what I am is, I consider myself as a student of nationalism. I teach political science. A lot of what I'm going to be saying is around the phenomenon of nationalism. Also I'll be speaking in English and alternating with Hindi, the two languages that I know best. I know there are lots of foreign students here, so please bear with me. When I speak Hindi, I will say the same things in English as well. So what I will be focusing on is the noxious notions of nationalism that drive Vladimir Putin and explain this aggression on Ukraine and how, in my understanding, this portends, it foretells the imminent collapse of the world order that we have known. So what we are witnessing is perhaps we are standing at the cusp of a changing world order. A changing world order that has been defined and dominated by ideas like nationalism, like free market capitalism, like these kinds of wars of aggression. And as Nivash said a little while ago, I do think that in order to understand the future, which we haven't seen yet, we can take recourse to the historical signposts that have been left behind by the 20th century. And it is my understanding, the way that I try to understand the present situation, that we are reliving the horrors of the 1930s. Waqt itna kharab ho chuka hai. When I was growing up, when I was a child in the 1980s, I used to think that all the big things have happened. The Second World War has happened, the British Empire is over, India has become independent, and these big things would not happen. But lo and behold, what we are witnessing is perhaps the biggest crisis that many of us in this room, perhaps I'm the oldest person in this room, I'm not very old, well I am just growing older, but I don't think anyone from my generation has experienced anything so apocalyptic, something so earth-shattering, something so dramatic that we just don't know what the outcome is. तो जैसा कि मैं कह रहा तो मुझे लग रहा है, अंदाजा मेरा ये है कि हम लोग एक दूसरे वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर के जन्म लेते हुए देखेंगे, और ये आसान कभी नहीं होता है. जब एक नया वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर इमर्ज होता है वो कभी आसान नहीं होता है. बिल्कुल वैसे ही है कि एक बच्चा जो अपने माँ की कोख से पैदा होता है, बहुत पेनफुल प्रोसेस होता है, बट ये ऐसा वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर है जो उसी बच्चे को खत्म करने की कोशिश कर रहा है. लेकिन जिंदगी के साथ अजीब और गरीब चीज है कि उसके अंदर एक अजीब जिद है कि वो जिंदा रहना चाहती है, वो आगे अपनी जिद इस तरह पूरा करती है. So with some optimism, what I do want to suggest is the savagery and the aggression that we are witnessing is suggesting the collapse of an idea like nationalism. So a lot of what I'm going to be saying will be on what I just referred to as noxious notions of nationalism. This is the way that I will try to understand this whole phenomenon. Let me also say one more thing. It's important that one does not take the holier-than-thou attitude that the Western media usually takes. When you watch BBC, for example, which I watch every night, the idea that the Russians are doing something terrible. The Americans and the British have done equally terrible things earlier. So, and I think it's important not to engage in what we often refer to as whataboutery. Oh, the British did, the Americans did. Fine, of course they did nasty things. But what we are witnessing right now is what the Russians are doing. And there's a certain kind of a division in the world which actually became very obvious last year. If you were following the G7 conference that happened in England, in Cornwall, it was very clear that there's an emerging division between the proponents of a very fragile, superficial democracy, which is what the West has always been all about. A paper-thin democracy, a kind of a carbon democracy, a democracy which is formalistic, which is just the bare bones essential of a democracy. As a result of which, it is quite often engaged in something called regime change. We've seen the effects of that in Iraq. So I do not in any way want to suggest that the West is completely above board in terms of its conduct. There have been hypocritical double standards. But at this particular moment, it is important to call out Russian aggression and call it out for what it is right now. Okay? It's also important to understand, and again, it's very unfortunate, the Indian abstentions on this issue at the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Commission. It's very unfortunate to see this. But at certain times of aggression, there's no such thing as neutrality. You're either on the side of justice or you're on the side of injustice. I think it's very, very important for us to understand this. So once again, the focus of a lot of what I'm going to be saying is this idea that we are reliving the 1930s. That what we are witnessing will be an imminent collapse of everything that we have considered to be familiar. Now, what are the things that we have considered to be familiar, that we've grown up with, at least people like me have grown up with, I'm sure that many of you have grown up with as well? The idea of democracy. Now, for some years now, many political scientists have been talking about the collapse of democracy. The first time that I was alerted to this was two Harvard professors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, talked about how democracies die. And what we are witnessing is certainly the death of democracy. This theme of democracies dying has been carried forward by many, many other political scientists. I mean, I can't name all of them. The ones that I have read is someone like Mark Chow, for example, the Cambridge political theorist whose name I always forget, but whose book is called How Democracy Ends. Now, the signs for this were very clear. The signs of this were very clear if one wanted to kind of read if one wanted to read the signs carefully. So let me go back to the year 2001, almost 20 years now. Okay, 2001 yaad kara, I was a student in JNU. The war on terror. It was a fraud, according to the words of the Australian journalist John Pilger. It was no war on terror. What the war on terror did was it allowed for a certain kind of aggression in the name of fighting terror. It unraveled democracy. It undermined many ideas like civil liberties that many democracies have become familiar with. And therefore, again, Nivash was pointing this out, what I think is that we are witnessing a certain kind of a global conjunction in which four things have come together. The 2001 war on terror, the 2007 financial crisis, the events around the coronavirus pandemic, which is very recent, and as the virus seems to have died down, all of a sudden we are assailed by this new aggression on Iran. So my point really is that if one looks at the first 21 years of the 22nd century, they present to us a conjuncture which clearly expresses that the world order that we know is a world order that is neither desirable nor is it sustainable. Now what that means is that we must envision and rethink what kind of world we want to live in. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, I'm sure many of you would have heard of him, he's my favorite economist because he reads a lot of political philosophy. So we did a lot of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He was a very avid reader of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. John Maynard Keynes, in his famous book that he wrote in 1936, wrote that if you look closely at politics, one finds that it is suffused and influenced by ideas. It is not about narrow interests, ideas like national interests. It is about certain ideas and how those ideas configure and influence the political the politics that we create. And what one notices very tragically is it's the bad ideas that have taken precedence, that have ruled over the world. One instance of such a bad idea is what I call noxious notions of nationalism, which I will come to in a little while. There are certain aspects of Russian nationalism that I have been looking at, which I would want to talk about. Now, why am I saying that nationalism is such a bad idea? Well, it was a good idea at one time. It was a good idea when decolonization was happening. Okay, so you had, for example, nationalisms animating the struggle against colonial rule. But what we witness right now is nationalism turning nation states genocidal. That's the problem with nation states. Now, when people talk about nation states, they usually trace the roots of nation states back to 1648 and the Treaty of Westphalia. Let me move it back a little more. Let me move it back 150 years before that. And let me move it 2,000 miles further south and west into the Iberian Peninsula. Okay? Westphalia would be Central Europe. I'm moving or suggesting that if we want to understand what is bad with the nation state and nationalism, one must be able to understand its origins not in 1648, not in Central Europe or Westphalia, but to understand its origins 150 years further back and 2,000 miles further west on the Iberian Peninsula. Now the Iberian Peninsula is that strip, that part of Europe which is beyond the Pyrenees, where Napoleon famously said there's nothing, That's where Africa begins. Now, why am I talking about, before I talk about this particular episode of history, let me say one more thing about the nation state and nationalism and the way that I'm trying to understand it. The nation state is that political receptacle that instantiates the diffuse idea of nationalism. That's why I'm understanding the nation state. So once again, let me try to define it. It's that political receptacle that instantiates, that concretizes, brings together a diffuse idea like nationalism. Now when it brings or instantiates or concretizes an idea like nationalism, it can become a very dangerous political configuration. Why does it become a dangerous political configuration? Let's go back to 1492. That is the year of the success of the Spanish Reconquista, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, and the fall of the Moorish Empire. Now what that gave rise to was what I call a perverse form of political monotheism. Remember, there are three monotheistic religions that are involved here. Okay, there's Christianity with the Reconquista, there's Islam, and there's Judaism. Now what the Reconquista did was that it subjugated these two monotheistic religions, and the monotheistic religions have always been at each other's necks for as long as they've been around. But what I'm suggesting here for your consideration is that what the nation state does is that it makes people worship exclusively at the altar of the nation state. There's a thing, excuse me. There's a famous French slogan, 16th century absolutist France. Forgive me for my French pronunciation. I tried learning French. Not very. Anyone from France here? I'm sure that some people know French. No one from France? No. I'm sure you know French, but pardon me for my French and my French pronunciation. I will even give it a go. The French absolutist slogan that I'm talking about is une loi, une foi. One law, one king, one faith. Now that's the kind of political monotheism that I'm talking about. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with this. You keep hearing from a certain someone who occupies very high political office. One nation, one ration card, one this, one that. I mean, this obsession with oneness, which is actually a form of political monotheism. Now, this is why I'm suggesting that the idea of nationalism is so dangerous when it instantiates and concretizes itself in the entity called the nation state. Now, what this makes the nation state is a potentially genocidal entity. How does it become a potentially genocidal entity? Well, it can become a politically genocidal entity when it weaponizes its sovereignty against its weakest. And that is what most nation states are likely to do. The idea of weapons of the weak is, of course, James Scott's very famous book that he wrote in the context of Malaysia. I'm twisting that title a little. The weaponization of a nation's sovereignty against its weakest. And this is what we see in terms of the aggression. Of course, about Russian nationalism, there are things that I will come to in a while. But I hope I've been able to kind of put forward why I consider the idea of nationalism so noxious, why I think it's such a bad idea, and how from the late 90s onwards, especially in a country like Russia, which again, as I keep saying, my disclaimer, I'm not an area studies expert. Okay, I do not know these regions at all, but I am a student of nationalism, and it's in that context that I'm trying to kind of explain my point of view today. Now, what one notices is what can only be called a recrudescence of nationalism. एक दोबारा से nationalism emerged, एक बीमारी की तरह. Okay, 1939 में I think Albert Einstein, not 1929 में, Albert Einstein ने कहा था, nationalism is an infantile disorder like the measles, and perhaps he got it spot on. That is exactly what it is, and which is why I use the word recrudescence. क्योंकि अक्सर होता है कि एक बीमारी होती है तो उस बीमारी दोबारा आती है, relapse करती है. A lot of people were, kind of got affected by coronavirus and दोबारा हो गया. तीसरे बार भी हुआ. I followed. And I think this is what is happening. That infantile disorder that Albert Einstein very famously called nationalism, like the measles, has experienced a recrudescence in the 1990s, in the 2000s. And what that nationalism has done is that it has made unscrupulous leaders like Vladimir Putin, like Slobodan Milosevic, like Donald Trump, et al., so on and so forth, etc., to weaponize this idea against the weakest of their respective nation states. Now, let me come to, as I said, there is a coming together of four, a configuration of four different aspects that I'm talking about. Let me just go over them once again. The 2001 global war on terror, which, quoting the Australian journalist John Pilger, I referred to as a complete fraud. It was not a war on terror. It had no interest in eliminating terrorism. Now, when I say this, a lot of people have accused me of, kind of going light on terrorism. Nothing of the kind. Terrorism needs to be fought through the creation of an international legal architecture. What the global war on terror did was it shattered the rudiments of that international legal architecture. It rode roughshod over the rudiments of the international legal architecture that was being created. Now, it destroyed, the emerging international legal architecture. Now, let me come to the 2007 financial crisis. Why do I want to bring that in? I want to bring that in because, quite remarkably, the people who were responsible for it were the ones who were rewarded. Kabhi aapne suna aisa? The people who created the mess were the ones who got rewarded. So the financiers of Wall Street, of the city of London, which will become very important because that's where a lot of Russian money is in parked, the Russian oligarchs. Where do they launder their money? Well, London is the largest financial center of the world, where all the bad fraudulent money of the world goes. And of course, Mr. Boris Johnson has been making a bit of a song and dance over sanctions. But the Conservative Party in the UK has certainly benefited from its close association with Russian oligarchs. And of course, Chelsea Football Club is one example. I don't like Chelsea anyway. So it's one example of Russian money being used to buy a prominent English Premier League football club. But let me just say a little more about the financial crisis. My favorite book on the financial crisis is written by the economic historian Philip Mirowski. 2007 का जो आर्थिक संकट था, वो क्या था? Simple terms में, जिन लोगों ने crisis create किया, उन्हीं लोगों को reward मिला. क्यों? क्योंकि कहा गया the banks were too big to fail. कमाल की बात है. अगर आप कुछ गलत करते हैं, तो आपको सजा मिलनी भी चाहिए. But it reminds you of that quote कि जब जो कानून कैसा है, एक बकरे की जाली की तरह है. छोटे-छोटे कीड़े फंस जाते हैं, बड़े कीड़े तोड़ के निकल जाते हैं. The law is like a cobweb. The big insects are able to kind of break their way through it. The little ones get caught. So who got caught? Well, the average taxpayer, the working class, the stagnating middle class, because of something called austerity. Austerity policies were imposed on most countries that suffered the most from the financial crisis. And of course, the biggest countries to suffer from the financial crisis, of course, was the US because of what is called the subprime mortgage crisis, where banks were giving money to people who they knew couldn't pay that money back. They just knew it. The UK, of course, suffered pretty badly. The continent of Europe. In India, we got off lightly. We didn't bear the brunt of it because of wise decisions that were taken by the Reserve Bank of India government, YB Reddy. उस वक्त Reserve Bank of India के पास autonomy हुआ करती थी, जो शायद अब नहीं है, because times have changed. But what the global financial crisis did, by giving rise to these policies called austerity, was it further weakened and worsened inequality. We are right now living through one of the most unequal phases of history. It is atrocious, immoral, and frankly speaking, unacceptable to see the kind of inequality that we are living through right now. Inequality that is being promoted and encouraged by the kind of economic policies that most countries follow. Recently, I was reading an historian called Walter Scheidel, and he talks about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and how he suggests that the only way in which inequality is being kind of mitigated or reduced is through four violent ways: state failure, revolution, pandemics, familiar with that, and there's one more which is a combination of state failure and revolution. I think this is what we are. When I talk about an imminent collapse of the world order, the reason why I'm talking about an imminent collapse of the first world order, of this world order, is because of what Scheidel refers to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. This world order cannot go on for the simple reason that this world order has created a form of inequality and levels of inequality that are simply unsustainable and morally unacceptable. And therefore, when we envision a moral order, a new world order, we must use our political imagination. ये सोचना पड़ेगा हम लोगों को कि आखिर कैसी दुनिया में रहना चाहते हैं. A world of free markets, a world of aggressive men, powerful, strong men who swear by their nations and who actually don't do anything, but apart from swearing by them? Or do we want to live in a world which is, kind of characterized by a lack of this social Darwinist, competitive markets, a world that is characterized by some level of empathy, some level of equality, some level of compassion, which of course is not evident in certainly Mr. Putin. So that is the second aspect of the configuration that I was talking about, the global financial crisis that resulted in a decade-long austerity measures. Austerity measures that hit the weakest the hardest because of the cutbacks in public spending on housing, on healthcare, on education. The most vulnerable were dependent on these public services. The 2007 financial crisis, and now I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that decade that had gone by, decade of 2010s. There were three major movements that I am considering right now in 2011. There was the Arab Spring that broke out in Tunisia. There was the Occupy Wall Street movement that happened on the 17th of September 2011, Zuccotti Park in New York. And then we had our own version of what my colleague Ajay Budavati calls the soap opera of the Anna Hazare movement. Now, I was always very skeptical about it. I was a young faculty member in those days. I just joined around that time. But what I want to bring up is that the decade that has gone by, the 2010s, is a decade of perhaps missed and lost opportunities. The reason why I'm saying that is that if you look back, one gets a clear sense of where things were going wrong. So I'll go to the year 2014. That is the year in which the Russians decided to walk into Crimea and invade it as if it was the 19th century. And they got away with it. Okay, this was the fag end of the Obama presidency. We still felt that there was some semblance of an international world order. 2014 is also the year in which all of a sudden we woke up and we realized that there was something called an Islamic State that has declared its existence in the territories of Syria and Iraq, the Islamic State in Syria is called. 2014 is also when we got the Modi government as well. I'm sure you remember that. But clearly, what that year indicated was that something was going terribly wrong. Something was going wrong with democracy itself. In fact, democracy had started resembling a Pandora's box. What is Pandora's box, I'm sure? The horrors of democracy. So, what I'm likening electoral ballot boxes to are a Pandora's box. Think of all the electoral verdicts that came out since then. 2016, Mr. Trump coming to power. 2016, the year of the Brexit vote. 2016, the year in which in Philippines, you had a man called Rodrigo Duterte, foul-mouthed, very uncouth. बदतमीज इसको हम लोग कहते हैं हिंदी में. Okay? Coming to power. Now, clearly what this showed is कि democracy में सब चीजें ठीक नहीं हैं. क्यों नहीं ठीक हैं? Because democracy has been gamed and compromised, undermined to give you the worst outcome. So therefore what I'm suggesting, and the word that I've often used, is the incorrigible nature of democracy. What that means is कि आप democracy से इस वक्त फिलहाल ये उम्मीद नहीं रख सकते हैं कि खुद बहुत करेक्ट कर लेगी अपने आप को. Okay, it cannot correct itself. What it requires is a larger understanding of where things have gone wrong. So if you're dismayed and disappointed by the UP elections, as I was, and many of you may have been, it is because of this incorrigible nature of democracy. It's been gamed. It's like playing loaded dice. Game of loaded dice. You just cannot win. Why is it happening? It's happening because of this larger political backdrop that I'm trying to bring up in this situation. Okay? 2016 is I think the year which most centrally brings up how many democracies were completely going wrong. I mean, horror of horrors. Established liberal democracies like the US and the UK were returning horrors like Brexit, and of course someone like Mr. Johnson, who yesterday had the indecency and the audacity to compare the Brexit vote to the resistance of the Ukrainians against Russian aggression. It was thoroughly criticized by other members of the European Union. Now this brings me to the European Union and NATO, which I think NATO has been rightly criticized for its eastward expansion and for creating this kind of a situation. Now what I want to suggest is that in this particular situation, the one organization that has come off with some degree of credibility is the European Union itself. Which the Brexit vote was against that. And again, to go back to the indecency of Mr. Johnson, who is one of my favorite politicians, because I talk about him so much. he actually compared the EU to the Nazi regime of the 1930s. I mean, that's sheer audacity for you. But to come back to the European Union, why was the EU created? It was created because of the great mistakes that were made in the early part of the 20th century between the two world wars. The mistakes of nationalism. When nationalisms are always at each other's throats, what you get is two world wars in the space of within 3 decades. That was the thinking behind what was originally called the European Coal and Steel Community. The Treaty of Rome signed in 1957, giving rise to the European Coal and Steel Community, giving rise to the European Economic Community, and of course by the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, the European Union. So what I'm suggesting is that the EU is a supranational organization that, in my understanding, has clearly understood the dangers of noxious nationalism and try to create this kind of a political entity. That's where Mr. Putin comes in. What animates Mr. Putin is a notion of a Eurasia. There are two a historian and a political theorist, who are behind his thinking. One of them is a very obscure and not very well-known figure, and is a historian called Lev Gumilev, whose parents were very famous poets in the Soviet Union, Nikolai Gumilev and the poetess Anna Akhmatova. Now, Gumilev gave rise to certain interesting ideas about the vitality of Russian nationalism as emerging from the vastness of the Russian steppes, that huge hinterland of Russia, away from Europe. So what I'm suggesting is that what one finds in Mr. Putin's aggression on Ukraine is this particular notion of what I call a very noxious nationalism. A nationalism that draws its inspiration from a certain raw vitality of the Russian steppes. STEPPES, that vast land. Steppes, or how you pronounce it, where of course the famous Mongol horsemen would ride their horses and ravage the cities that came in front of them. That's where a lot of the ideas are coming from, and I'll say a little more about that, but let me just step back a little. What I'm kind of juxtaposing are two different notions of political organization, of continental political organization. One is a notion put forward by the European Union that looks towards the Atlantic and the ocean, and of course towards America. The other is a land-bound continental idea of domination, Eurasia. So what we're looking at is the EU against Eurasia. The idea of Russian nationalism that animates Mr. Putin, that explains his expansionism, that explains why he is in Ukraine and why he may, for all you know, want to go into the Balkans. I may be wrong, but my sense is that the Balkans will be the next region where the crisis may spread, for the simple reason that old ally of Russia, Serbia, will be primed into aggression, and we've seen the ravages that Serbian nationalism created in the 1990s during the Balkan crisis. So, the distinction that I'm trying to draw is a distinction between an Atlantic Ocean-facing notion of organizing continental powers, and then this Russian notion of Eurasia, which is landlocked and which seeks to draw its vitality from this vast landmass that kind of comes all the way up to Central Asia, the Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, which were part of the Soviet Union. And the thinking that is behind Mr. Putin is to revive the glories of the Soviet Union, and not just the glories of the Soviet Union, but the old Russian Empire. Because if anything, nationalism emerges from the rubble of crumbled empires. It's a point that one of my favorite theorists of nationalism, Roger Brubaker, makes in his book, Nations and Nationalism Reframed. The point that Brubaker is making is, if you want to understand nationalism in the 20th century, it's all about how nation states, and I've already talked about the dangers of nation states, how they are the rubble of huge behemoth-like entities, empires. So एक बड़ी इमारत जब गिरती है, उसको जब ढा दिया जाता है, तो बहुत सा उसका rubble emerge होता है, and that is how one can understand nation states as the rubble of old crumbled empires. And there is a certain kind of a vainglory, this kind of grandiloquence, in which perhaps Mr. Putin sees himself in the figure of perhaps Peter the Great, the famous Russian emperor of the early 17th century, if I'm not wrong, who established the city of St. Petersburg, looking outward onto the Atlantic seaboard. Okay, it faces the Baltic republics, onto the Baltic Sea, and west towards the West. Let me make my next point, which is that this noxious notion of nationalism that we see is arising from a tension between a Western-looking Russia and an Eastern-looking Russia. Something we find in India as well. I'll come to that. Okay, so indigeneity that has all of a sudden captured the imagination of academics, and which is part of the new economic policy as well, if we look at it carefully. But this Western-looking Europe and Western-looking Russia and Eastern-looking Russia. Why I'm bringing this up is because in the little history that I've read, and as I keep saying, I'm not an expert in these areas, what I have noticed is a certain kind of a tension within Russia, within the Russian Empire, of an elite that is enamored of speaking, let's say, French, or is enamored of the culture of let's say, England, which is a powerful country at the time, and a larger Russian hinterland, which is not equally enamored of it. It's a bit like the distinction that we make in India between India and Bharat. The anglicized, English-speaking elites, and of course the indigeneity that we see, which, and that tension is really kind of tearing the country apart. Something very similar one can find in Russia and the emergence of this new nationalism in Russia. Now this is a point that I first came across. Again, I am not someone who's read too much Russian literature, but the one writer that I have read is the famous Alexander Pushkin, and his famous work, Ewan Onegin, which a lot of it, which is about the southern boundary of Russia. Ukraine becomes very important because Ukraine, the legacy of Ukraine, is from the noble Cossacks, the horsemen, who had a particular democracy of their own, and that is what seems to rile Mr. Putin. That's what he's scared of. A certain idea of democracy capturing Ukraine at his doorstep. उनकी दहलीज पे जिसको हम लोग कहते हैं, wonderful word, isn't it? दहलीज, threshold. किसी ने कहा दिल्ली का नाम दहलीज से आता because it was the threshold of the rest of India. So right on his doorstep, a democratic stirring would be something that Mr. Putin could simply not countenance. So what I'm bringing up here is what I'm calling the dangers of this revitalized, recrudescent nationalism. Let me say a few things on the two theories that I want to talk about, and let me just also keep track of the time, because otherwise I'll just go on and on. What time do we begin? You can speak. Okay, two theories that I'm going to be talking about. Okay, Lev Gumilev, I just referred to him, and the other one, a man called Alexander Dugin. Now, I haven't read these people's books. I just started considering their ideas. Now, Dugin wrote two books. One is called The Foundations of Geopolitics, and the other one, more recent, is The Fourth Political Theory. Now, why I'm suggesting these ideas are dangerous is because they draw from a certain discontent of the Russian hinterland, and by drawing from the discontent of the Russian hinterland, create a certain kind of grievance towards Russian elites, and especially the Russian elites that were enamored by the West. Something very similar that we see in India. I mean, the Lutyens elite, as it is referred to, Lutyens and Lutyens elite, the Khan market gang, something very similar. So what we have is nationalism basically as a form of extreme discontent, whose discontent one can understand, but then one is horrified by the particular form that discontent takes. So in terms of this particular nationalism that I'm talking about, I'm trying to juxtapose the ocean-facing Atlantic seaboard European Union contrasted to the landlocked notion of Russian nationalism. What I'm also suggesting is that two things that Mr. Putin must have really enjoyed watching was putting Mr. Trump into the White House and engineering Brexit. That would have significantly weakened the European Union. Now, there is a lot of work that suggests that there were Russian hackers behind the Brexit vote. So the Internet Research Agency based in St. Petersburg, sending targeted messages on people's Facebook accounts, ensuring that they were convinced to vote against the European Union. Brexit is something that I've recently written a book on, and I consider to be a very dangerous phenomenon. I'm not looking at it as a phenomenon of merely English nationalism, but as a larger global trend that underlines how dangerous the atavistic strivings of nationalism can be. Atavistic strivings of English nationalism against Scottish nationalism, Irish nationalism, Welsh nationalism, and the vote to kind of leave the European Union. So it is that what I just referred to, the phrase that I've just used, atavistic strivings of nationalism, which is something that really concerns me as someone who is, to be very honest with you, scared of the phenomenon of nationalism. Scared of the deep primal urge of obliterating the other that nationalism can give rise to. And going back to the idea of the genocidal nature of the nation state and how it can result in what I referred to in the early part as a weaponizing of sovereignty against the weakest. That is why I am so concerned about the kind of nationalism that we are seeing across the world. The other theorist that I talked about is a man called Alexander Dugin. Again, these are things that I've just recently started looking at. So I cannot claim to have read these books. I do intend to if I can get my hands on them. But where do these books seek their inspiration? Well, quite remarkably, Gumilev seeks his inspiration from the 14th century Arab philosopher Ibn Khaldun. Some of you may have heard of him. Okay? Ibn Khaldun's idea of asabiya, an Arabic word which refers to a certain kind of cohesiveness of people. A cohesiveness that gives rise to a vitality that can make a subjugated or a backward people of the hinterland who he refers to as the Badawa win over an effete luxury, an effete urban elite that he refers to as the Hazara. Okay, so the notion of asabiya is a notion that people have found a certain parallel with in terms of Gumilev's understanding of, and the concept that he uses, the Russian term that he uses is passionarnast, which can be translated loosely into English as passionality. So what does nationalism do? It creates a certain kind of unwarranted passion, a certain inexplicable passion that is beyond the realm of reason. There is no reasoning with it. And that is what makes it so dangerous and so thoroughly insurrectionary and so at times so completely insane in terms of what it strives to achieve. So Gumilev's term, passionality, where is that coming from? It's coming from what he feels is the vitality of the hinterland and the tribes that used to, and actually still do, occupy that particular stretch of land. The Scythians, the Mongols, two of them that I can remember. There are 5 or 6 that he talks about, but these are 2 that I can remember. Quite often, these groups of people who ride on horseback, ravaging the countryside and the urban centers that come in their particular path. So when I talk about what I refer to as atavistic striving, I'm trying to kind of struggling. Okay, how do I translate atavistic striving in Hindi? Okay, so जो एक अजीब और गरीब जज्बा, एक ऐसा जज्बा जो किसी भी अकल से नहीं समझा जा सकता है. ओके, जो अक्सर अकल को ओवररूल कर देता है, जो एक ऐसा इमोशनल स्टेट, एक ऐसी जज्बाती कैफियत जिसके खिलाफ आप अकल से नहीं लड़ सकते हैं. आप अपने रीजन, अकल का इस्तेमाल करेंगे तो वो वापस आपको ही आके अंडरमाइन करेगी. यही मसला है इस वक्त के नेशनलिज्म के साथ. भारत में आप देख लें, आप किसी भी तरह का रीजन आर्ग्यूमेंट करने की कोशिश करें, शायद आपके ऊपर वापस बूमरैंग कर जाए. जिस तरह से I've tried. Well, कभी कभी नहीं समझता हंसे आदमी पे रोए इसमें, बिकॉज ये बहुत ही सीरियस सिचुएशन है. इतनी सीरियस सिचुएशन जो शायद मैंने तो अपने लाइफ टाइम में नहीं देखा. जो again what I'm urging is to please understand the magnitude of this moment. We have not seen anything like this for the last 100 years. जो वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर बदलेगा at some time जरूर बदलेगा, बट उसकी उस तब्दीली को आने में इस कदर नुकसान, इस कदर ब्लडशेड, इस कदर वायलेंस होगा, इस सोच के इंसान परेशान हो जाता है. इंसान का जहन दहल जाता है ये सोच करके. The thing about nationalism एक अजीब और अजीब नशा है. एक नशा है जो कि रीजन को ओवरराइड कर देता है, जिसमें हर चीज जस्टिफाई हो जाती है. एंड देयरफॉर इसका अल्टरनेटिव क्या है? Which brings me to my third and fourth of the larger configuration. The coronavirus pandemic, which is still not over, अब तक खत्म नहीं हुआ है. Now, एक चीज जो क्लियर हो चुकी है कि ग्लोबलाइजेशन की वजह से हम एक दूसरे से इस कदर जुड़े हुए हैं कि एक इंसान शायद जिससे मेरी मुलाकात कभी नहीं हो, उसकी सेहत और मेरी सेहत कहीं न कहीं जुड़ी हुई है, कनेक्टेड है. Okay, it's a certain notion of cosmopolitanism, जो Stoics के ज़माने में बात करते थे, which is completely against the idea of nationalism. Now, one of my favorite religious leaders is Pope Francis. The Pope that I remember is from my childhood. पहली बार मैंने सुना कि एक institution Pope का होता है, वो Pope John Paul II, whose politics I was very much against. But this Pope certainly speaks a lot of sense. Pope Francis, the current one, Argentinian. Liberation theology, has a background in Marxist liberation theology.
He comes from a different...
Completely different. If you might have watched this movie on Netflix, Two Popes. You might have watched the movie. It gives you a good explanation of the thinking of this Pope and how it's different from the earlier one, the German. I forgot the earlier. Benedict.
Pronounced his popeship by being alive.
Yeah, that's right. Now, at the height of the pandemic, this is what Pope Francis said. He said that the narrow walls of nationalism cannot keep the virus out. I think it's one of the most eminently sensible things to say. Today, he has asked nations to stop this repugnant war, as he calls it. And it is a repugnant war. One searches for words to actually capture how horrendous the thing is that we are witnessing in Ukraine in terms of the Russian aggression. Now, I'm bringing this in to suggest that in terms of envisioning a future, the next world order that we are talking about, one needs to think of the things that we can do without. The reason why I say this is, because again, I'm a very old person, going back to the 1980s. There was an English song that we used to sing, or Angrezi Gana for us, become a little kind of in the eyes of other people. So, a group 30 Years for Fears, okay, uska Gana tha. Shout, shout, let it all out. These are the things I can do without. Now, the thing about this particular group, Tears for Fears, it hit the top, #1 charts in the US and the UK, 1988, mid-80s now. The thing about it was premised on something called the primal scream therapy of a very controversial American psychiatrist called Arthur Janov, Janov. Okay? Now, I think this is the situation we are in right now. It is so completely desperate that the only thing that you can do is let out this kind of a primal scream at the top of your voice. Now, the irony behind that kind of a primal scream is that people around you can't listen to you. It reminds you of that famous that painting, Norwegian expressionist Edvard Munch. Some of you may have seen that painting. Okay, Munch's painting, The Scream. I think he made that in 1914. He was Norwegian, at the height of this kind of a creeping fascism in Europe. But what does that represent? That represents the need, I mean, at least some of us experience this, of wanting to scream out against this injustice that we are experiencing, but the scream not registering at all. That is the kind of strange, impossible predicament that we are in right now, and it is so utterly frustrating. It's like, being in a bad dream. You're being chased by a ghost or something, or something of that kind. My own childhood dreams. Screaming at the top of my voice, no one around listening to me. Now, the reason why I bring in this particular group is because they talk about the things that we can do without. And therefore, I encourage people to think about the things that we can do without. There are 3 things that I can think of that we can do without as we envision a new world order. And I repeat, a world order जो हम लोगों को नहीं मालूम है उसकी क्या नौवियत होगी, कौन सी शक्ल अख्तियार करेगा. It's like being behind a veil of ignorance. Rawls's term. When you're behind a veil of ignorance, you don't know what's on the other side. And that is our situation right now. We know that this world order has to change. It will change, and hopefully it will change for the better. But we have no clue as to what lies on the other side. One of the ways in which we can decide what can be on the other side, or what we can create and configure on the other side, is by thinking of things that we can do without. 3 things that I can think of immediately. It's an open list. Keep on adding to it. Ideas of nationalism that act as aggressions on the weakest. The point that I made about weaponizing sovereignty against the weakest. Free market capitalism. Strong, powerful leaders who are actually pretty weak men. Okay, pretending to be very strong. I mean, think of Mr. Putin and his manly aggression that he projects on the screen. It's all a particular kind of insecurity. One thing I was hearing about Mr. Putin yesterday is that he keeps watching that video of the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi and his end up. Aapko shayad yaad hoga. The way he's drawn out of the culvert, shot by people. He's mortally scared of it. We will all die. That's what I think we will all die. But he's really scared of it. And therefore the point that I'm making is, all these big, strong men are actually not that strong at all. Reminds me of that, my favorite story from childhood. The story of the naked emperor. Remember that story? Of the emperor who said that he must be dressed in regal finery. So all the great tailors of the realm were asked to come. One person came along, two tailors came along, and said, we have the perfect solution for you. And they put on something, and he said, I can't see it. He said, well, that's the point, you can't see it. This is the spin doctrine that we have become victim to. It took the little child to point out that the emperor is naked. And I think we have lost that innocence and curiosity of children because of the effects of spin doctrine, which Mr. Putin is very good at. You look at his more than 20 years of his rule. It's been all about spin doctrine, the propaganda that Russia today is. You watch Russia Today, which I sometimes try to watch, and it seems as if he certainly lives in an alternate reality. Where actually he's not the aggressor. He's not the one who's launching genocidal violence. It's actually the Ukrainians who are launching genocidal violence. I'm going to try to end now because I've really gone on for too long and I need to kind of draw all of this together. How long will this war last? We don't know. I think this is the 26th day. When it began, and I remember we were talking to Balaji that day in front of the very day that it all began. It's been 26 days. I hope I'm wrong. Okay, I can apologize for being so pessimistic. A lot of my students know that, CPS students, sorry for my pessimism, I can apologize. This is unlikely to stop. This is likely to spread. And I think we are in for a really bloody decade of 2020s. We are truly reliving the 1930s. And as I said at the beginning, in order to try to understand what lies on the other side of this veil of ignorance that I talked about, it is important for us to try to envision what kind of world we want to live in. Because what lies on the other side is not fated to be given to us. It is something that we can craft and configure. Okay? I will end, and permit me the extravagance of an Urdu poem, because that's the only way that I can think in terms of the insanity of these times. The language of social sciences breaks down. So I'm going to quote the famous Urdu poet Iqbal and his idea of what lies on the other side. Okay, and he says, "Aalame no hai abhi pardai taqdeer mein." The new world lies unknown behind a veil of ignorance. Aalame no, new world. Hai abhi pardai taqdeer. Parda is a veil. It's being crafted and created as we speak. Meri nigahon mein iski seher hai behijab. But I can with my eyes glean what lies on the other side. It is for us to use that sense of political foresight that places like JNU still have. And we will strive to see that it will continue with this political foresight and battle the imbecility that we see all around JNU, the intellectual imbecility as the famous Norwegian-American economist Thorsten Veblen referred to his universities, very, very embittered by the universities that he taught in. And he talked about the institutional imbecility of universities. But we will see to it that we will battle this institutional imbecility that we see all around us. And again, to end on a poetic note, not because it's the only way I can convey my anguish. The famous lines of the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, that we will rage against the dying of the light. How do you rage against the dying of the light? Well, by lighting a small diya as we do in this country. That's what JNU symbolizes. The logo of JNU symbolizes the light of truth, enlightenment, emancipation. That's how we do it. That's how we will go on doing it.